Okay, so if you've been following me for a little while, you would have seen me upload some physique shots and some food related content and discussing the phase I'm in, whether it's a bulking phase or a mini cutting phase. That's mostly what I've been doing lately for the last year or so, maybe a bit longer, is alternating between bulking and mini cutting. Now, the main reason for this is because my long-term goal is just to gain as much muscle as I can, and ideally to stay as lean as possible while doing so. Now, you would have heard of a traditional bulking and cutting sort of cycle where people will go through a phase where they intentionally eat in a calorie surplus to gain weight, and ideally as much of that weight as possible is muscle. And then at some point they start a cut where they eat in a calorie deficit, and then they cut as much fat as they can while maintaining the muscle. And the idea is that after doing both of those, you finish with more muscle and less fat. The slight difference with what I do is I typically run a longer bulk because I want to spend as much time as possible gaining muscle, and then a shorter mini cut, which is just like a cutting diet, but harder and faster. Because you can cut fat quite quickly if you're experienced with dieting, with little to no muscle loss. Muscle loss is not something I'm really worried about. It's actually quite difficult to lose muscle if you're doing things properly, and if you do, you gain it back very quickly. So the idea is we bulk typically for around 5 months, somewhere but 16 to 20 weeks, 4 or 5 months, and then mini cut for around 1 month, usually like 4 to 6 weeks type of thing. So what we're going to be doing is reviewing my most recent bulk. It's the most recent bulk? Reviewing the last bulk that I did, which ran from about the 1st of October in 2023 till the 21st of January in 2024. So I'm going to go over, that's the time frame, but I'm also going to go over what the goals were and the results that we got in a fair amount of detail. So when I started this bulk, my main goals were to continue counting calories, even though I was bulking, because I wanted it to be, I don't really like the term lean bulk, because I think people just don't pull that off when they try to do that. But I wanted it to be a responsible surplus. I didn't want to get too fat too quickly. So I wanted to continue counting the calories. I was aiming to gain about half a kilo each week, and I was mainly aiming to grow my entire posterior chain, so predominantly the upper back, the lats, and the hamstrings. On top of that, I was also hoping to improve my cardio, just sort of my running ability and my general cardiovascular health. So those were the goals. I want to run through the results with you. In the time frame, which was about 18 weeks, my weight went from 90 kilos to 102 kilos. So that means I gained about 0.6 kilos each week. That's pretty close to the goal I wanted. It's a little bit faster, but I'd say that was pretty successful. Unfortunately, I did fail to count my calories the entire time. So after about 2 months of consistently counting them, and near the end of that 2 months, I'd have days where I just couldn't be bothered, or I'd eat out a bit too much, and I just wasn't able to correctly estimate what I was eating. What I realized was that even when I wasn't counting, my weight was on track whether I counted or not. So essentially what I decided to do was have a full diet break, which pretty much means no counting, no attempt at dieting. You more or less just eat when you want to eat, as long as I stayed on track. So as long as I stayed gaining about the right amount of weight, not undergaining and not overgaining, I would just not count calories. And essentially, it's not really something I'd recommend, because what basically happened was I just got lucky that my natural hunger signals were perfectly aligned with my goals. So if I just ate when I was hungry and I just ate what I wanted to eat, I gained the right amount of weight. So as for the muscles I was focusing on, I actually decided to have separate workouts for the lats, the upper back, and the hamstrings, and do each of those 2 times per week. I know it's a bit unusual. It's, often my splits are not the kind of splits you'll normally see, like push-pull legs or upper-lower or, body part splits or whatever. because my programming, first of all, I typically train twice a day, and that gives me a lot of wiggle room for more advanced programming. And so I want to use that programming to really focus specifically on what I'm trying to do. So when I started, my lats were by far my weakest area, and I was a little disappointed with their growth over the training cycle, unfortunately. They did improve, I trained them a lot and we were in a calorie surplus, so I would be surprised if they didn't improve at all. But I think it would have been better if I hadn't tried to grow my upper back and my lats at the same time, because there's a lot of similar muscles involved, the rear delts, the biceps. The lats are kind of used on rowing movements and vertical pulling, so there's kind of too much interference there. If you're a relatively new trainee, beginner, intermediate, it's sort of a case of the more you do, the better. But when you're more advanced, you need to specialize more, and using muscles that interfere with each other can actually interfere with the growth as well. Anyway, so after the lats, there was the upper back. That was actually growing quite a bit slower than I expected at the start of the bulk, because in the past, my upper back tended to grow quite easily. By upper back, we're talking about like traps, rhomboids, sort of rear delts, that kind of area. And what I realized, at first, I was using a ton of flexion row variants, which you would have seen if you follow me on Instagram and that sort of thing. That's the type of row where you actually let your spine bend over, like people say you're not supposed to do in a deadlift. You let your spine bend over, and then as you do the pull, you stick your chest out. So there's a lot of spinal flexion and extension as well as the pulling. So these are a fantastic exercise, but what I realized is they're just a little bit too unstable because of the spinal movement to adequately overload the upper back muscles. Because when you're very unstable, your body doesn't allow you to produce as much force, and your upper back muscles, or at least my upper back muscles, are quite strong, and so they require quite a bit of force going through them and tension in order to grow. So my spinal erectors grew quite a bit. They kind of outpaced everything else, and that looks cool, but I was hoping to grow my upper back. Once I realized this, I swapped some of my flexion row volume for just more standard heavy rows, like pendlay rows and some machine rows and stuff, and my upper back started growing faster. Lastly, we had the hamstrings. They probably benefited the most from this cycle because it was the first time I trained them really hard, but didn't train my quads hard. Normally people train legs. Most people train quads a bunch and then hamstrings only a little, or they do both about evenly. Here, my quads were just on maintenance. I was barely training them, but I was going really hard on the hamstrings, which is kind of rare. People don't do that very often. And I'm more convinced than ever that a huge stretch under load is the most important part of essentially any exercise for hypertrophy, because I was able to grow my hamstrings lifting weights lighter than anything I'd ever lifted before just by focusing on the stretch. I've deadlifted 265 kilos. I've done stiff leg deadlifts for reps, even stiff leg, standard stiff leg style Romanian deadlifts with at least 170 kilos for a number of reps before. And this time I was doing really stiff leg, like locked knee stiff leg deficit deadlifts with 30 or 40 kilos, getting crazy hamstring stimulus, sometimes good mornings as well in a similar fashion. So way less weight, and my hamstrings just grew like crazy. So all my other muscles did okay. There was no muscle loss anywhere, even with a lot of them being on sort of maintenance mode or minimum effective volume. Some of them actually seem to improve a little, namely the biceps and pecs. I'll see if we can get a shot of those. And the whole time, no joint pain whatsoever, which was pretty fantastic. Aside from all of that, I also started doing some yoga about 2 times a week as my evening session. So I normally do AM and PM. This time, these 2 days a week, the PM session would just be some yoga. I'd say it helped improve my mobility a bit and probably contributed to preventing joint pain. I'll be completely real with you. Yoga or Pilates or whatever, these kind of things is not going to be the one hidden trick that unlocks your real athletic potential. People tend to overvalue these kind of things because they're a little bit different, they're a little bit quirky. They can help, especially in terms of preventing injuries. I would say they can help there. But yeah, it's not like some secret trick that's going to turn you into a super athlete just because you started stretching or whatever. But they can be good though. So I also decided to test a bit of a theory I had that abs should be trained primarily during a bulk rather than during a cut. And I think it went very well. They definitely look and feel bigger. But if I'm going to be honest, my waist is already kind of big. So I actually don't know if that's a good thing, but it seemed to work. I guess, the whole point of this is that I just would not suggest training your abs during a cut when you're trying to lose fat, because when you're cutting, your muscles are not going to grow unless you're like a brand new beginner. So that time and energy you spend doing extra training for abs to try and make them look better is not actually going to do anything. And that's time and energy you could spend maintaining other muscles or doing more cardio to burn calories, or just recovering, because when you're cutting, it's harder to recover. So primarily, I think if you want better abs, like bigger ab muscles, as opposed to just more visible, because that's the leanness, you should train your abs when you're bulking. And I would say that went pretty well this time. So lastly, in terms of improving cardio, I think that went pretty well. I went from just sort of begrudgingly getting my steps in, which I was doing over the previous cut just because I knew I had to burn the calories, to being able to make sure that I can keep my heart rate over 120 beats per minute during cardio. 120 beats per minute is about the point at which I get into the low intensity steady state range. You get the heart health benefits and the metabolic benefits and that sort of thing. And often, instead of just barely getting to 120, by the end, I would get up to 130 beats per minute. And later, I started doing bouts of much harder cardio and occasionally getting as high as 180 beats per minute, which I couldn't even handle doing before this. So my resting heart rate and my blood pressure both improved, even though I gained weight. Though personally, I'd still like to get my blood pressure down a bit further. The mini cut after this bulk, helped with that, but we'll review that next time. But I'm also improving my diet and cardio in general, sort of like lifestyle change style, as well as adding in some supplements to keep improving the blood pressure. The thing that's important about this and why I focus on it, first of all, like high blood pressure is just very bad for you, chronic high blood pressure. And you will never be as big and strong as possible if you let yourself get too sick to train and grow. It's just obvious. Anyway, as an overall assessment, successful bulk. Maybe I could have grown a little bit more. Maybe I could have picked my priorities better, sort of, which muscles I should have focused on. But I think I learned some things and grew some muscle, and I got to eat a lot of tasty food. So I think after this, it was time for a mini cut, which is actually just finished now at the time of recording, and then another good bulk after that.